This is Bonjour Chai, the This Land is My Land edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltzvoe. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk with Jesse Brown of Canada Land about how to seek truths and draw lines through the fog of war. Does protesting Israeli policies outside Jewish community institutions cross a line? Can any act of anti-Semitism be dismissed by saying it's about Israel? Stay tuned for all that. Just before we get started, though, I wanted to let our Toronto listeners know that we will be doing a live event at the Lay Apostles Theatre this coming week. We're excited to be launching Holocaust Education Week in Toronto, and we will be speaking to author Michael Frank about his book 100 Saturdays. Tickets are available online at the Holocaust Museum website, which we will link to in the show notes. I would love to see you there. That is this Wednesday, November 1st at 7:30. Tickets available online. And now, on to the show. Phoebe, how are you doing this week?
All right. How are you, Avi?
I'm okay. It's been an interesting few weeks, both globally but also personally.
And globally we know. Why personally?
I've actually moved. I've moved out of Canada. My wife got a job, and I decided to follow her along, as is a good idea when you are married to somebody. And I've moved to the northern suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, in the U.S. For those of you who Canadians
familiar with that country.
But I am still committed to this show, and we will talk about it more extensively later, I'm sure. But my life has been packing and unpacking boxes for the past few weeks. That's why I missed last week. And that has become my life.
I'm sure you'll be unpacked eventually, but yeah, moving's a lot.
Eventually,
so, yeah. And now we're an American in Canada and a Canadian in America. Although I am actually also Canadian now. So
yes, I'll let you know when I get my whenever I get my dual citizenship, but I don't think that'll happen. But I'm here now. I'm around. I'm doing my thing. And
is the shopping a lot better in America? Like the choices?
I don't know, because I haven't been out to a store lately. It's been a week of just nonstop like home unpacking. I've gone to Home Depot a lot. I'm told that the shopping has a lot of choices. There's a lot more stuff.
Are there Targets?
There are many Targets, as there. I don't want to go into the double entendre.
Trader's Joe. Is there Trader Joe's there?
There are many. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, I'll report back. I will do the full retail report when I am finally venturing out of it.
I am impatiently waiting to find out all about it.
Let's get to our main interview with Jesse Brown right after we hear from our sponsor.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
So almost 3 weeks have passed since Hamas went on a rampage through Israel, and in the ensuing time, we have seen both deeper and deeper polarization and an attempt to shape the narrative on a minute-by-minute basis. This makes for an almost perfect storm of both misinformation and disinformation, and so in an attempt to make sense of some of this, we turn to a stalwart of combating misinformation, and someone whose takes on the Jewish community are often as insightful as they are ignored by those who most need to hear them. Jesse Brown is the publisher of Canada Land and the host of its eponymous podcast. Jesse, welcome to Bonjour Chai. Or should I say welcome back.
It's nice to be back. Thank you for having me.
So one of the things that I'm seeing now more than ever is that people have become their own spin doctors, right? You can watch the news and decide on the spot, depending on whatever your preconceived notions are, what is actually being said. I don't think we should always be blaming the news media itself, for example. But for example, they're reporting about the Gaza hospital explosion. The news media often receives the brunt of the ire of both sides of any contentious story. How do we as news media, and I'm not necessarily including myself all the time, but we are part of a news media organization, how do we do a better job of telling the story without telling people what to think about the story?
Well, I think that the facts have to come first, and that's an easy thing to say, except for the fact that the facts are hard to come by. It's hard to get firsthand reporting from Gaza. The fog of war is real. as you say, the efforts to spin information, counter information, contradict information. There is an information war that's being waged by both sides. And there is such a passionate appetite for evidence that will support one narrative or the other that things spin wildly out of control and are seen by millions and millions days before we are able to analyze. And there is a growing skill set and community of people. I'm not one of them. OSINT is what it's called, open source intelligence, who are not on the ground, but who are diligently analyzing multiple, video files from different angles and comparing and contrasting and looking at maps and really trying to figure out if official narratives could be true. And, over time we see things like the New York Times back away from its early framing, which put an incredible amount of credibility in Hamas's claims, and then changed their headline as that day went on, and then ultimately issue something of a correction mea culpa, saying we put too much credibility in these claims. And then just on Wednesday of this week, finally, there's an analysis that I think will please neither side, but it does offer. The Times put out, a detailed analysis that says some of the information that Israel put out, attributing the blast to a specific failed Hamas missile, is not accurate, which does not mean that Israel was lying. And maybe they thought it was true, but the timing of that particular missile, the footage that Israel released, it could not have been that missile, which is not to say that it could not have been a different Hamas missile. So when you are super responsible and diligent about the facts in a situation like this, you'll often arrive at not knowing. And where I'm at with this is not necessarily trying to figure out how can I know more, because from where I'm standing, I publish Canada Land. I don't have a bureau, and even those who have bureaus in Israel often don't have feet on the ground in Gaza. And even if you do have feet on the ground, they can only see from their perspective. I'm trying to figure out how we deal with not knowing. And people are very uncomfortable right now with uncertainty and not knowing, because these narratives become the basis for what happens next and for how we feel about things. And people want the facts to fall in their direction. So I'm just I'm really trying to be thoughtful about every communication I put out, because the last thing that anybody should want to do is inflame things right now further.
I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who got angry at me, mock angry, but still it was, he was explaining to me how my whole yeshiva education and my whole religious upbringing was so focused on harmonizing texts and always looking for ways in which the texts are going to work well together. And he's like, texts don't always work well together. Stop trying to look for answers to the story and that create a story. Always look for problems. And it's okay to live with problems in the text and just leave it at that. And I think that as humans, we're fundamentally uncomfortable with not having a narrative, especially not having a narrative that fits the narrative that we want it to fit.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think that there's this really stark dichotomy between these incompatible narratives and the problems that we live in, and the practicality, the physicality, the reality of just human lives, and the physical space and the physical organisms themselves being destroyed. What are we fighting here in Canada? What are we engaged in here? Because I think that what we say to each other, and whether this union comes out on this side or not, or this politician, few things matter less to the conflict as to which positions we take or what we say on our social media. But meanwhile, it's rending our relationships apart in these horrible ways, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to see. I can take the trolls or just strangers, but when you know people and you've worked with them and you hear them sharing or encouraging messaging that seems to dehumanize or deny things to be true, it hurts. It hurts a lot.
Do you want to give some concrete examples of the sorts of, not the people, of course, but of the sorts of things where this comes up?
So, I'm thinking about this these days. You brought it to mind, Avi, with respect to the idea of incompatible narratives that can't harmonize. So this week, I'm a little rattled because I broke my own rule of just like not weighing in unless my job forces me to when I saw on social media that a protest that had been organized to protest, a free Palestine ceasefire. Seems like a perfectly legitimate cause for people to take to the streets to protest, and the target seemed perfectly legitimate to me to go and protest outside of Chrystia Freeland's office. And a day or two later, photos emerged that, where is Chrystia Freeland's office? It's right across the street in Toronto from the Jewish Community Center. And I know this Jewish Community Center. It's a place where children go to learn about Judaism. It's cheder. It was a day school, not anymore. It's a daycare currently. It's also a place of worship.
It's a swimming pool. It's like a Y. Also, it's a big thing.
It's also just a community center. For the community.
Yeah.
But the protest, at least at one moment, turned towards the Jewish Community Center, and the protesters. Unless this photograph is just I'm trying to imagine a way in which this photograph could be somehow misleading me. But the protesters are turned and their signs are turned towards the community center, and the megaphone is turned and the people's attention is turned towards. And it very much seems as if at one point a large group of these people, if not all, I don't know if all of them were, but a large group of protesters were protesting the Jewish community center. And I know how mobs or crowds can it becomes disorganized and inchoate, and one person's chant can, there's a moment like that, and maybe people corrected themselves. I'm referring more to what happened afterwards because I tried to just hew to the facts, and I tweeted out against my better judgment, this is not the Israeli consulate. This is not Chrystia Freeland's office. This is a Jewish community center. That's all I said. And predictably, a lot of people, liar, Zionist liar, it just happened to be in front of the Jewish Community Center. This was actually Chrystia Freeland's office that was being protested. And, it doesn't really bother me that people were making those accusations.
Why doesn't that bother you? That seems bothersome, no?
It's just so incredibly predictable,
okay.
and it's I understand that I think that people involved in those protests, I might not use this language to describe it, but there's no denying that there is an incredible amount of death happening, and people who feel like all they can do is take to the streets to oppose what's happening in Gaza. So anyhow, passions are inflamed is all I'm saying. What I was taken aback by was a number of people who I know and have worked with not arguing with me that the protesters were protesting the Jewish Community Center, but instead arguing that is a legitimate target.
Yes, that is the thing I wanted to talk about, because that is the turn I have seen all of this taking. And it's something I'm very familiar with from my knowledge of just how it's gone in France in the last few decades, where sort of anything, and just in general, it seems like there's a more, in Europe, it's been for a while now that anything anti-Jewish can get a kind of, it's actually about Palestine spin, even if it clearly isn't, even if it's arguably harmful to Palestinians. Like if, putting a swastika on a synagogue, how does that help Palestinians? Obviously not at all. But what I've seen is that seems to be migrating to North America. And the specific example I'm thinking of is this Cafe Landwehr incident that I was just reading about in the Maple on the website. It's a restaurant that already clearly anticipates anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, however you want to put it, and I'll parse that in a minute, but in that it calls its cuisine Mediterranean, which I always find interesting, like the Mediterranean couscous, anything Israeli is Mediterranean, lest anybody not want to touch anything to do with Israel. But anyway, the idea that harassing people eating in a Jewish cafe is actually really because you care so much about Palestinians that you would do that, because if you really look it up, the owner is actually Israeli. It's like this whole long convoluted thing. It's like, no, this is a Jewish restaurant. if you really, or if you're such a purist that any Jew who has any connection to Israel, either by happenstance, because they happen to be like Israeli, they may, hate Netanyahu, but they happen to be Israeli, they may have Israeli family, they may feel a sort of cultural, personal affinity to Israel, whatever their politics, if any Jew in the diaspora who has anything to do with Israel is a fair target for the minute they're targeted or even killed, then, well, you know what? It's really part of the fight to free Palestine. First of all, it isn't. It isn't part of the fight to free Palestine. And but the bigger part of this, though, that I want to get to is I really think that this ought to really impact how we talk about this whole, sort of, when the people who are really talking all the time about fighting anti-Semitism, I don't know if they understand what it currently is in North America. And that's my rant. Sorry.
Well, they don't understand it the way that you do and the way that you just described it. And that's the incompatibility of the narratives. You can – I think it's worthwhile to read that piece in the Maple and to read what I agree are convoluted justifications, because I want to understand what we're witnessing happen in real time.
Oh, sure. I think everybody – I linked to it on my Twitter. I think people should read it to understand that mindset for sure.
No, I'm not saying that you were suggesting otherwise.
Yeah.
And not to lend any credibility to it, but my understanding of what they're saying is that there's a long-established BDS movement that boycotts businesses. There's a lot of what? We've been doing this forever, and this is an Israeli-owned business, and there's connections with the founder to the IDF, and it's a perfectly a legitimate target
to not eat at. To not eat at. I've never been to Cafe Land.
To not eat
you know
at,
what I
right.
mean? Who?
But that is not to get jargony, but that is to gaslight that something new has happened here. That this is not something we've seen before in Toronto, where you fine boycott whoever you want to boycott, but for protesters to take to the streets to confront and protest protest is against something. It is physical and it appears angry, and so for a group of people to angrily confront the diners, what we're building here is a justification and a rationalization to target Jews. And that's how those are the words that
it's been accepted. It has already, I think, been kind of accepted that if you can twist it to say that it's anti-Zionist, it's fine. And you can basically always do that because virtually, nearly all Jews are some sort of pro-Israel, not necessarily right-wing, but some sort of positive feelings towards Israel, therefore Zionist.
But if we want to, I agree that it is twisted, but I think that look, we are having a conversation right now, and I think it's a good conversation to have, and I want to have these conversations right now. I want to talk to other Jews about this. I a lot of it is just about catharsis and feeling community, but this is a bubble, right? The operative thing for me is there some way? I don't know about harmonizing these narratives, but people are locked in to a narrative where I don't feel like people believe that with intentionality they're trying to find a way to target Jews. What I want to get across to people is I don't care what your intent is. The outcome of these justifications and rationalizations is that you are targeting Jews. If the JCC is a fair target because they raised money for the walkathon or something, if that makes the JCC a fair target, then every synagogue in this country and every Jewish day school in this country and every place where Jews congregate to eat a bagel, you are...
So we're France, basically, now. I mean, that's what this does.
Look, in effect, you have to understand that you have crossed a line here where I know, and I have said and I have criticized Israel, that you can criticize Israel without criticizing Jews. That is of course that's a possible thing to do. But
I would go even one step further and to say that you can be anti-Zionist and still not be anti-Semitic. But the problem that you're highlighting is that at the end of the day, the vast majority of people don't believe in that distinction anymore, don't see that distinction as valid. To them, anti-Zionism and
vast majority
does
of which
mean
people, Avi?
of people
Jews
that are
and non-Jews?
of people that are protesting for freeing Palestine right now are basically saying, well, anybody that is Jewish is basically a Zionist, and therefore I have the right to target Jews as a result of that.
You will not find that's not
I said
true.
the vast majority.
What do you,
You
Avi?
explain to me
What is anti-Zionism? I think is an important thing to talk about, because I think I saw somebody recently saying that a prominent journalist, I won't name her right now, although I probably have on the podcast before, saying that she's not a Zionist because she's opposed to all theocracies.
So,
Which just seemed like, I think there are a lot of different definitions. I think if you support the right of of a Jewish state in part of that area, even in very restricted borders, even not in its current borders, even if you hate Netanyahu, you're still some sort of Zionist.
So to the 2 points here, I liked the way that Jeremy Appel, when he came on the show a while ago, defined it. He said he was a culturally Zionist in that he believed that he loved the culture of Israel and the people and stuff like that, but politically he was anti-Zionist and he didn't believe what was going on with the state and the government and the policies was something that he wanted to abide by. So that was, like, I thought, a fair way of framing that, and I just want to hold that.
Seems a little silly to me, but yeah, go on.
I want to just put that there.
Okay.
But then the other thing, and I think you said that theocracy, and I think that's the line that is actually the thing that is harmonizing, Jesse, but is incredibly difficult for people to think and accept, is that at the end of the day, there are religions here, right? When you hear a Palestinian with a rock seeing a rocket go overhead and saying Allahu Akbar, he's doing this not because he's saying that, like, Israel as a country is bad. He's saying Israel, the land of the Jews, is bad. And Jews, when they go and say this is our land, it's because they really believe that God gave them this land. Do you
think all Zionists are? I mean, how did Herzl feel about that? Do you think Herzl was motivated by God?
I actually think Herzl was in the minority, and that's why Herzl was willing to take other countries, potentially. But I think that the people that go and say this land is 3,000 years old and it belongs to us because of that, there's some deep faith that connects so much Judaism to that land, and nobody wants to accept and recognize that there are religions that are at war here, and that's a lot messier than just saying these are two countries that are fighting for a scrap of land.
I think a lot of people recognize that this is, I think a lot of people, I would counter this and say that I think a lot of people see it as only like Jewish versus Muslim and imagine that it's much more religious than it is. I mean, there are obviously very religious people involved, but not exclusively, and it is political.
I see you smiling, Jesse. You have, like, so much to say.
I have so little to say. I'll go get a sandwich and you two can figure out a good definition for Zionism.
Tell us how Cafe Landwehr is.
I only want to return to something Avi said before, which is that the vast majority of people, the line has erased that between anti-Zionism and anti-Jewish. I want to tell you, I think you would have trouble finding one person at the pro-Palestine rallies who will go on the record and say out loud something against Jews. I think you'll have difficulty. It is simply not been my experience covering this or talking to people. The belief that they are not striking out against Jews is nearly unanimous. Okay,
that has been historically the belief of many, like
sure,
with the exception of the like French official, like in the late 1800s, anti-Semitic political parties. Everybody says they're not against Jews, but like there was somebody. Yeah, go on.
Sure. They're against rootless cosmopolitans.
Yes, exactly.
I understand the history. We might understand this better than the people who are engaging in this understanding.
Impossible.
And I don't necessarily think that's because they're lying. I think that they believe that, right? And if we're talking about these incompatible narratives, that is the incompatibility that our job here in Canada is to try to find, if not harmony between these narratives. Like right now, everything I see through this lens of these incompatible narratives, right now I see Jews in a moment of profound grief and triggered trauma where everything we've been told since we were kids, it could happen again, it will happen again, and when it happens again, your neighbor won't care. And we're like in shock because it's happening. And at this moment of our grief, we're looking at these protesters and saying, oh my God, how could they not recognize, how could they come to where my kids go at this particular moment? But we are in a different narrative. They are in a narrative where Jewish grief is a precursor to Palestinian death. And that's right. They're in a narrative where when Jews start talking about the memories of the Holocaust, that's when you got to be worried because that comes before a much greater death toll. So we are not speaking the same language right now. You know,
I think you're 100% right. I was having this conversation with somebody this week, and they couldn't believe that I was in a position to say, you can be at a peace festival, at a music festival, and assume that everything is great in the world, and all of a sudden death and destruction reigns on you, and the person for who death and destruction is doing the reigning of death and destruction is somebody who has been seething mad with anger for decades. And yes, they've been planning this, but it's not like they just out of the blue decided one day, hey, we're going to go and kill a bunch of Jews at a music festival. We are planning this because we have been displaced, we have been murdered, we have been under the thumb of somebody, and that is the belief that they have, and it's okay to acknowledge that person believes something that makes you the enemy.
Okay, so I think I guess this is where, like, I've said this before, and it feels very strange to say it now in light of all of the news. I don't think that Palestinian anger at Israel is anti-Semitism. I don't think that that's the right framework to understand it. I think there is contested land, obviously. I think that that's just a geopolitical fact. Where I do see anti-Semitism is when Westerners with no particular skin in the game throw on the keffiyeh because they're just delighted for finally a chance to be like, fuck Jews, basically. That's where I see anti-Semitism sometimes entering into. Not always. I think there are people who are like actually just genuinely moved by the news they see from Gaza. I think that also is part of it. It's complicated.
It's very complicated. And when I think about the Westerners, I have complicated thoughts. Like, I think that there are no shortage of people who do have skin in the game, who either have family or are connected to Palestinian diaspora. And I want to ascribe they feel more people who are afraid for their families or their relatives in Gaza right now have more in common with diaspora Jews than anybody else.
Of course,
right?
Totally.
And a lot of those people are traumatized in a very similar way as we are at this moment, and those people are at those protests. And then when it comes to Westerners who have taken up this cause, I think it's important to try to figure out what they're thinking, and I don't think that it started with anti-Semitism, and then for the majority of them, and then they found this vessel. I think that anti-Semitism
disagree, but go on. Yes.
I which is not to say that I don't think it's anti-Semitic. I think that a lot of people who are involved in various, anti-colonial and progressive causes and anti-imperial, anti-American causes. And I think that once you've been immersed for many, many years into an anti-Zionist narrative, I think that it's almost like that's the mechanism through which anti-Semitism can be trained, using very different words for it. But you arrive at the same place, But I don't necessarily believe, and I don't think it's constructive until I find evidence that this is like, for most people, this is like, oh, I'm going to dress my anti-Semitism up in this because this is socially acceptable. I know that that's a popular narrative, but I think that there's a lot of young people who get involved in these politics who don't have any opinion one way or the other about Jews. And even Jewish people get involved in these politics and find themselves like, brick by brick building this narrative, which I think on the other side does come out as anti-Semitism.
And I think they sometimes imagine that they will be then considered the exceptions, because if it's mere anti-Zionism to hate Jews who are at all Zionist, if you're the least Zionistic Jew of them all, you'll probably be fine. Maybe.
Yeah, I think
unless you get a bagel at the wrong place.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of people rebelling against their parents in the mix. There's a lot of stuff going on. But rather than assign intent to people where I don't know what's in their hearts and minds.
I don't think I know what's in hearts and minds either. I mean, I see this as useful for just understanding what's going on and wrapping your head around it. I don't see this as that I'm going to say X is an anti-Semite. There's no use of that. I don't think Phoebe, you can know hearts and minds. Yeah.
By your extension, then no Westerner should ever get involved in any sort of human rights struggle. You should say that by saying that I am against the Uyghur genocide, I am being anti-Chinese. And that's not right, because most people are just saying I care about the Uyghurs. I don't not care about the Chinese people.
There's this, I'm thinking about a modern Western, modern European history and the Holocaust and pogroms and all of this and expulsions of Jews and just the whole history of like
but people don't
where
know
white
this
people
stuff.
come from. No, they may not know it, but these things get passed down. And I think this idea that, oh, well, after 1945, anti-Semitism went away is a bit silly. Like it does these things. First of all, it persisted in all sorts of ways in the mid-century. And I don't think that these people still really hate Jews. Like my life is apart from my CJN work is mainly not around Jews. Most of my life is not around Jews, and a lot of people really do hate Jews. Yeah,
people find all kinds of creative new ways to hate Jews, and people have historically found ways to hate Jews without thinking that they're hating Jews. And I think that's. It's a baffling and fascinating phenomenon over the course of centuries, and I think there's an element of it right now. And yet I'm trying to find some space to afford as much good faith as I can to people who are doing things that I find abhorrent. I'm trying to find as much space like, okay, I think this person doesn't necessarily understand the extent to which they've just re-traumatized and harmed people. If you say that you're trying to save lives in Gaza, maybe that is part of what's motivating you. And maybe like if I can accept that, then maybe there is a way to have a conversation with my neighbors, because I know that my family in Israel will never really be safe until conditions are better for Palestinians. Right? Mm-hmm. So maybe there is some future that can.
But could I just ask, when you say that you're trying to think of it, think generously, I can understand that if it's people protesting at a big rally or on a campus or something like that. I can understand it if it's somebody, tweeting Free Palestine or something like that. But if I'm thinking of this incident in New York at Cooper Union where these Jewish college students were like trapped in a library or something. I don't know, or this Cafe Landwehr thing. All of these incidents where Jews are genuinely like physically threatened, or people associated with Jewishness are physically threatened. That's where my generosity towards these views starts to go away, because I would like to see as few people dead on all sides as possible. I would like some sort of, I don't have the military strategy for doing this. I'm not that sort of expert or whatever. But I just have trouble seeing that as I see that as just ramping up of violence, not as an anti-violence. I might understand that there's emotions behind it, but like I lose any generosity towards people like that. And all I just want to say is basically like the sort of fuck the fuck off type thing is more my take on it.
I don't disagree, and it's sort of like knowing where that line is of trying to think of things sympathetically or generously, and then like that is the Jewish Community Center, and that's when I spoke up. Mm-hmm. And then not to say fuck off, but to say, I'm still trying to communicate. I'm like, do you understand what that is? Do you understand what you just did?
And I think they do, and they think it's Zionist. They think that the JCC is a Zionist entity, and maybe they're right, and maybe anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism aren't as easily separated as all that. I mean, that seems like another possibility. If you define Zionism as thinking Israel is an existing country that can go on existing, perhaps with different borders, then you're a Zionist, right? I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah, I recently had a conversation with Emily Nicolas on my podcast, and she said something that I've been thinking about ever since, which is we hear, is peace possible? Has this destroyed for the hope for peace? And we always think of peace as some far off, maybe possible, maybe impossible thing that will happen in Israel. And she said, my answer to that question is itself a question. What are you acting in the spirit of peace here? Is the last thing you said in the spirit of peace here? So the type of communication that I'm trying to avoid is one where I communicate like trying to feed the passions of like, oh my God, does anybody else get as angry as I feel about the fact that they're now protesting the Jewish Community Center? Or they're going, oh my God, look what they just did. Even though I really want that echo of understanding from somebody else, that I'm not going out of my mind here, that something awful did just happen. But that type of communication it's not communication of peace. It's a communication of who are my allies, and let's together get indignant and angry about what they just did. So the only communication that I'm trying, beyond just like my role in trying to like set out a verified record of facts as a journalist, I stepped outside of that because I hope that some people who are involved in the pro-Palestine movement might see that and understand that from within a different bubble, within a different narrative, they just did cross a line. And I did get calls from people who are involved in that organization trying to separate themselves from it and say, well, actually, I was informed that the former board member of the group was now a former board member who was organizing that rally. That kind of dialogue where we're setting those boundaries, where a group says, I just want you to know that wasn't our group. We're no longer with that person. That's an important conversation to have, because that is a recognition that what I'm saying isn't like, oh, fuck off, that's a perfectly legitimate target. That is somebody calling me and saying, yeah, that shouldn't have happened.
So I want to ask you something that's related to this, and it's about inflaming passions, and it's about looking for, like you said, the good as opposed to the opposite. There are organizations, there are advocacy organizations within the Jewish community, like Honest Reporting. There are organizations like that on the Palestinian side that for years, and not just in times of war, but in times of relative peace, are scouring media and sending letter campaigns to CBC anytime they do something wrong or that they perceive as doing something wrong. And I wonder, I think that those types of organizations, I'll put my cards out there, are not looking to valorize, to say, hey, what is the other side? Maybe there's something here. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe the other side actually has a point. It's always about my narrative and how do I get my narrative across to a news organization. There's got to be a better way than having this low-level simmering of passions always around on both sides, saying, here's my narrative, I need my narrative out there. There's got to be a better way to make sure that news media is getting the right message or doing something right without having this, which I think is like tinder to the fire when there's some sort of fire happening. It's these types of organizations that have been leaving things on the fire for so long that cause issues. You must have something to say about this. I don't know. I've been ranting.
Yeah. No, Honest Report. I have there's a history with any journalist who's ever touched this stuff in Canada and these organizations, and part of me to my
producer, you could just say Avi says Honest Reporting Canada and Jesse goes off instead of my long-winded.
Yeah, all you had to do was mention the name. Look, I think it's fine. There's so many different groups or peoples that have advocacy groups, it's not a nefarious. It's a fine thing to do. But it delegitimizes the other narrative. It's doing exactly the opposite of what you're saying is the most important thing we should be doing. That's right. Look, there's this battle that we have in Canada over which side is the media shittiest to. And as a media reporter and media critic, people come to me with their receipts and say, look, here are 20 examples of the media being shitty to Palestinians. And they can prove it. The language used, the passive voice versus the active. That is media bias against Palestinians. And then there is just as long a file of the media being it's ultimately the media case by case, story by story, fucks up all the time, has all kinds of bad tendencies, and I'm not trying to shrug it off because it is my job is that it does matter what the media says about these things and the language that we use. But no one's going to win this fight of the media is actually against my people. What I am kind of stuck in with groups like Honest Reporting and CJ and like these media watchdog groups is this weird reverse action thing where they monitor aggressively, comprehensively. They're very good at it, and part of the problem is just how good they are at it. They will push back if they feel like anything. They'll kind of push back in their interpretation of what the media is saying, not just what the media is saying. And they'll use every means that is legally and civilly available. They'll call an editor. They'll call your boss and they'll say, I don't think your newspaper should be publishing these things, right? Now, then on the other side of that, and it does make a difference because it just means that reporters are incredibly careful because it's just like a story that you might have just filed and moved on to your next story. You're now defending in a meeting, and then you have to you do have to worry about what these groups might say. And maybe that's good. Maybe that makes your journalism better. But on the other end of it, what you get are, like, I had to correct a Palestinian pundit who was on my show saying, oh, these groups, like, they bully the media. They have undue influence on the media. And then she crossed on and said, well, I think they give money to them. I'm like, no, they don't. They don't give money to the media. Like the idea that they've bought better coverage. I'm like, look, there's another group that advocates for Muslim people when Muslim people are written about in an unfavorable way. And maybe there's, I don't know, I haven't looked at the budgets to see which group has more money, but like what ends up happening is these groups are so diligent, and I would say aggressive is a fair word, that it ends up fueling a narrative of Jewish media control. It ends up fueling the narrative that every newsroom is quaking in their boots because of some all-powerful Israel lobby.
Well, what do you make? Can I just interrupt? I was just wondering what I feel like whenever there is an anti-Semitic incident, and I think this may be Canada and the U.S. I mean, I've historically, having only been Canadian for a few weeks, followed this more in the U.S., where there's an
Mazel tov.
Toda rabah, as they say. But what I have found is politicians or whoever will speak out about an anti-Semitic incident and say, we do not stand for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Now, I too do not stand for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. But it just seems like there's something where Islamophobia is always mentioned when there's an anti-Semitic incident. I don't know if there's a corollary. I haven't studied this. Just something.
Right. Do they also say that they're against anti-Semitism when they decry
And I mean, I'm not even saying they should. I don't think they should in either direction. I think you can just say you're opposed to the hate thing that had just happened without it. Because I think this is, again, I think this was a good insight from Black Lives Matter, that to say Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. And I think that was a fair point. And I think one that paradoxically can be extended to all groups. You can say
but you can't say all lives matter.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm talking about.
So you're absolutely right that politicians, I think, are very careful to not want to appear that when they are decrying anti-Semitism that they are therefore pro-Zionist or that they don't care. So they also throw in and we're against Islamophobia. And I want to be very clear, that is something that I just don't care about at all. I'm absolutely okay with them saying that. It doesn't matter to me at all. I don't need them to singularly highlight anti-Semitism, even in a moment where anti-Semitism is. I know what's going on behind that, and bigger fish to fry.
Of course, there are bigger fish to fry. It's just something. It's just interesting. I don't see this as the main crisis facing the world today. I see this as like an interesting component.
I'm not trying to correct or like pass judgment on like the process by which a lot of my feeds with like friends and relatives is like searching through like picking apart these things and highlighting them. I is again like I'm like, where are we going with this? What are we trying to demonstrate with this? It makes me feel like, yes, these like there is a strain of anti-Semitism. There is like this isn't fair, and I'm trying like. There is a point at which I feel like we do have to speak up. There is a point at which it comes to our synagogues and our community centers and cafes and like Jews are targeted where we do have to speak up. But like I question the value and just my own kind of self-care and what I want to like sit in. I'm trying to avoid like a certain kind of echo chamber that I feel puts me further and further away from like a dialogue with where the conflict might actually progress to something better. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think it's where I would have sat a few weeks ago, to be honest. I don't know. I think I might be... I still read stuff on to return to Avi's point about honest reporting. I haven't really followed that particular thing, but whenever I see something from sort of that general part of politics, I realize that that's not any better. And yeah.
I'm also kind of done going hat in hand to the non-Jewish world and demanding that they regard our humanity or demanding that they are polite when we grieve or demanding like at the point at which I do want to take a stand, it's not a stand of like, please, I'm human. I'm done with that too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm. it's hard to sit on both sides. And I think to go back to my original point, I think when somebody genuinely means I'm against Islamophobia, great. I'm also, in addition to, anti-Semitism and all that, when you can tell that it's something, but it's not working towards harmony. It's not working towards sitting with the other side when you say, yes, anti-Semitism is bad, horrible, we have to fight it. Oh, and also Islamophobia. That's a tagline. And if I was Muslim, I would realize that I was being tokenized there and I was being used just as a cover to say, you see, it's not just about anti-Semitism. I wouldn't like that. The problem with the honest reporting approach is that there's really this notion that like my narrative is the only narrative above all else, and it doesn't serve right for the years that they exist. Like I said, between these conflagrations, right? It doesn't serve either side to have somebody you can go and say, this is the only narrative that exists. My narrative is the one that has to work, and your narrative has to be put down almost by definition.
I agree, and I was reading one of my many detractors in the Canadian media, Terry Glavin, had a piece that I thought was a pretty persuasive and fiery piece of editorial writing in the Post today. It was just going on about the embrace, the gleeful embrace of Hamas that we're witnessing happen, and the kind of cheering on of the paragliders and the things that are being said at these protests that are not just pro-Palestine, but they're pro-Hamas and they're explicitly anti. I'm like, yeah, he's right about all this. Where it ended, though, was just in this place of just outright condemnation, and I don't know where we go from there. Like, I don't know. There can be no sentence given. There can be no justification. Like, I'm not trying to justify what Hamas did, but like, why did it happen? Was it bound to happen? Something like that. Will it happen again if things are left in that state? Like, those are the only questions that ultimately matter. Mm-hmm. But what he was asserting was to ask those questions, given the level of atrocity, is out of the box, is to justify atrocities. Can't do it. This is a hateful Jew-hating movement, and to hell with them. And where does that just leaves us where we were on October 6th, waiting for the next one?
I couldn't agree more. And I thank you, Jesse, for coming on. Mazel tov on your 10-year anniversary. With Canadaland. If you have to support one media organization in Canada, you should support the CJN. But if you support two, you should also support Canadaland as well.
You've got a lot of really smart listeners, and I'd love it if they checked out Canadaland. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Jesse. Great to talk with you.
And now it's time of the podcast for our nachas. Phoebe, is there anything that's been giving you nachas this week?
Well, as usual, I have to dig because my life is work and little children, and then after they go to sleep, doing some good old-fashioned doom scrolling and reading about how the world is falling apart. But sometimes I try to take a break from that, and I did so via a New York Times article by the very good fashion writer Vanessa Friedman. I don't know if Vanessa Friedman's Jewish or not, and I don't really care, called Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, Ghost Influencer. And it's about how Carolyn Bessette Kennedy is kind of, despite having died tragically at age 33 in a plane crash in 1999, so not last week, her look is really the look of the moment, and people love it. And fashion brands are trying to sort of emulate it, and sometimes in these kind of like ghoulish ways of like the paparazzi shots of her, they recreate in some kind of fashion spread, and people are, anyway, have mixed feelings about this in the comments, and the comments to this article are hilarious, sort of inadvertently hilarious. All these people who really miss the elegance of a bygone age, and the bygone age is like 1997, and I'm thinking, what are they even talking about? But it's just very entertaining. But it's actually she dressed pretty well, like that. No joke. Like this, I read through this article, and the outfits they would kind of hold up now, and that's it was a long time ago, so it's kind of interesting. And it was just very diverting, and also just, yes, it's bleak, it's death and all of that, but like it's not as bleak as perhaps all death is sad, but like it's a less bleak story than everything else. So I got a kick out of that. I did my newsletter, non-CJN newsletter on it, because I just found that the comments to this extremely entertaining. Anyway.
Yeah.
How about you, Avi?
the retroness is real, and it's I'm old
But
enough.
it doesn't
like
look
you said,
retro.
to really-
That's the thing. The
That's-
outfits
well,
look
look,
just like they look
it's-
like they all come from Aritzia.
The problem is that we are in that moment, and we were listening to Sublime in the car this morning, and I did the mental math for when Sublime came out and realized that when Sublime was out and I was listening to it, the music that would have been in terms of time difference was like 50s music, and I'm like,
Oh boy.
that was now
50s
I get
music, not even like the Beatles. Oh.
I think it was early 60s. I think that may have
Okay.
been.
Okay,
I
so
was
it could
trying
be
to
Beatles.
remember.
All right.
Anyways, yeah. My nachas. So I went back and I reread Amos Oz's small little essay, "How to Cure a Fanatic," I believe it was called. It came out in 2001 in the wake of 9/11. And while I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the stuff that he says in there, he has some very, very important points and beautiful points. And one of the points that he makes is one of the hallmarks of a non-fanatic is the ability to laugh, and the ability to often laugh even at your own, at tragedies, sometimes internally. And I'm not going to make jokes about the tragedy. I was very heartened that almost immediately in the past few weeks, the memes that were coming out were actually kind of funny and interesting. There was something going around the internet about how like this guy shows up at the airport in New York with like 54 duffel bags of medical supplies for getting on the plane and going to Israel, and the security guy looks at him and goes, "Did you pack all of this yourself? Where are you going? Is this all for personal?" And like that the security there is going on. Or when Biden went to visit Israel, somebody asked if he had his number because they have a small package to send to Israel. Could they maybe, could he maybe carry it along with him? And like the ability that we have been having to find moments of joy in this tragedy is heartening. And I look forward to hearing more of those and seeing more of that humanity in the coming weeks and months.
I agree with you. Humor always good.
Well, mostly, not always.
No, I mean always. It needs to be not in all contexts. I don't mean like leap into some sort of conflict zone and be like, so Ovaltine. Why do they call it Ovaltine?
Should call it Round
anyway.
Team.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent.
But yes, I think we are in agreement on this.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending October 28th, Shabbat Parashat Lech Lecha. The show is produced and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.